6 men sat in the total darkness of a limestone pocket beneath the Ashaw Valley, listening to the sound of something dragging itself across the stone floor. We had M16's grenades and a radio that had stopped catching a signal 3 hours ago. The air down there was thick, not with the humidity of the jungle, but with a dry, musk, heavy scent that tasted like copper and old dust. The dragging sound stopped. Then, from the darkness just beyond the reach of our last dying flashlight, came a sound that I still hear when the house is quiet. It was a rapid, wet clicking, like stones being struck together inside a throat that was too long for a human neck. Whatever was hunting us was not Viet Cong. It was not North Vietnamese regulars. It was something that had claimed that mountain long before we drew borders on a map. So, before we continue, please make sure you leave a like and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. I still remember the smell of the monsoon season in 1970. A scent of wet rot and red clay that settled into your skin and never really washed off. We were operating 10 miles from the Laotian border, in a sector of the highlands where the maps were mostly guesswork. The brass called it a reconnaissance in force. To us, it was just another long walk through a green hell that wanted to kill us as much as the enemy did. I was a corporal then, 22 years old, carrying a rucksack that weighed 60 pounds and a sense of dread that weighed considerably more. I had arrived in country in late '69, thinking I understood what war was. I thought it was about lines of fire and securing hills. By the time we reached that ridge in the mist, I knew that the war was just a surface activity, a noise we made on top of a land that was old, patient, and indifferent to our politics. Our squad was designated Echo 3. We were a Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol, or LRRP, meant to move quiet and see things without being seen. The team leader was a staff sergeant named Miller. He was a career man from Wyoming, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of hardwood and left in the sun too long. He didn't talk much. He communicated in hand signals and flat stares. He kept his rifle clean and his socks dry, and that was about the extent of his religion. Beside him was Kowalski, a heavy-set gunner from Chicago who carried the M60 machine gun like it was a toy. Kowalski complained about the heat, the bugs, and the beer back at base, but he had eyes that picked up movement in the bush better than anyone I knew. We had a medic we called Doc Evans, a skinny kid from Ohio with nervous hands who wrote letters home every time we stopped for 5 minutes. There was Baker, the radioman, who was 19 but looked 15. He had lied to the recruiter to get in, and now he carried the PRC -25 radio on his back like a penance. The last man was our Kit Carson scout, a former NVA soldier who had defected and now worked for us. We called him Dow. He was a small man, wiry and silent, who moved through the elephant grass without bending a stalk. Dow usually had a sense for the enemy that bordered on the supernatural. If he stopped, we stopped. If he went prone, we ate dirt. But on this patrol, Dow was different. He was agitated. He kept looking at the ground instead of the tree line. He touched the amulets around his neck constantly, his fingers moving in a rhythm that matched his breathing. Our mission was to locate a suspected NVA supply cache, believed to be hidden in a complex of caves near a limestone ridge designated Hill 802. Intelligence said the enemy was moving heavy equipment through the tunnels at night. They said the thermal scans showed heat signatures deep under the rock. We didn't ask questions. We just loaded the slicks and flew out to the insertion point, watching the green canopy rush by underneath the helicopter skids. When we hit the LZ, the grass was waste. High and the heat was a physical blow. We moved out in a column, Miller on point. Dow just behind him, the rest of us spaced 5 yards apart. The first 2 days were standard. We humped through the brush, fought off leeches, and slept in shifts while the rain hammered the leaves. The jungle has a rhythm to it. There is always noise. Monkeys, birds, insects, the wind in the bamboo. It is a wall of sound that never stops. But on the afternoon of the 3rd day, as we began the ascent up the lower slopes of Hill 802, the rhythm broke. It wasn't sudden, it was a gradual fading, like a radio being turned down. The birds stopped calling. The insects went quiet. By the time we reached the tree line below the ridge, the silence was total. It was heavy, pressurized. My ears rang with the lack of sound. It felt like the jungle was holding its breath. Miller signaled for a halt. We took a knee in the mud. The rain had let up, leaving a thick mist that clung to the trees. I watched Dao. He was standing perfectly still, staring up at the gray rock face that rose out of the vegetation 100 yards ahead. The rock was jagged, covered in patches of moss and vines, but there was something about the geometry of it that looked wrong. It didn't look like natural erosion. It looked like something had been broken open. Miller moved up to Dao and whispered something. Dao shook his head. He didn't look at Miller. He kept his eyes on the rock. I saw Dao make a gesture with his hand, a sharp cutting motion near his chest, and then he pointed not at the ridge but at the ground beneath his feet. Miller frowned and checked his map. He motioned for us to move up. We pushed through the last belt of thick scrub and came out onto a shelf of bare stone. The vegetation ended abruptly, like a line had been drawn in the soil. On one side, the jungle was dense and tangled. On the other, the ground was sterile gray rock, swept clean of debris. There were no leaves, no branches, no animal droppings, just bare stone. Kowalski shifted the M60 on his shoulder and muttered that he didn't like the feel of the place. He said it felt like a graveyard. Doc Evans was wiping sweat off his glasses, squinting at the rock face. Baker was trying to get a comms check, but he just shook his head. "Static, Sarge," he whispered. "Just white noise. Can't get base." Miller told him to keep trying and signaled for us to spread out and sweep the base of the cliff. We were looking for a cave mouth, a bunker slit, anything that looked like a way in. I walked the left flank, my boots making a dry crunching sound on the stone. The air here felt different. It was cooler, but not in a refreshing way. It was a stagnant cold. I found the opening 10 minutes later. It wasn't a small spider hole like the VC usually dug. It was a vertical fissure in the cliff face, about 8 feet high and 4 feet wide, hidden behind a curtain of dead, gray vines. The vines weren't green like everything else in the valley. They were brittle and pale, as if the life had been sucked out of them. I signaled Miller. The squad converged on my position. We stood in a semicircle around the opening, weapons raised. Miller used his machete to clear the dead vines. They snapped apart with a sound like breaking bone. When the opening was clear, a draft of air hit us. It was the smell that stopped me. In Vietnam, everything smells like wet earth, mildew, and vegetation. The air coming out of that hole was bone dry. It smelled of old minerals, ammonia, and something sour, like meat that had been cured in smoke. It was a preservation smell. It triggered a primal warning in the back of my brain that had nothing to do with military training. Dao refused to go closer than 20 feet. He stood back near the tree line, his M16 held across his chest, shaking his head. Miller walked over to him. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw Miller's jaw set hard. He grabbed Dao's shoulder. Dao pulled away, speaking rapidly in Vietnamese, pointing at the dark mouth of the cave. Miller let him go and walked back to us. "Scout stays here," Miller said. His voice was flat. "Says the hill is hollow. Says bad spirits sleep inside. We have a job to do. Kowalski. Take point, I am second. Corporal, you are rear guard. Watch our 6. We checked our flashlights. We checked our ammo. We stepped across the threshold out of the gray daylight and into the throat of the ridge. The transition was immediate. The moment I crossed the line of the rock face, the humidity vanished. The air inside was still and heavy. The light from our L-shaped flashlights cut yellow beams through the darkness. The floor of the tunnel was not rough stone. It was packed earth, smooth and hard as concrete. It sloped downward at a steady angle. We walked in silence for the first 50 yards. The tunnel was uniform, roughly 6 feet wide, with walls that arched gently to meet the ceiling. I ran my hand along the wall as we walked. The rock felt slick, but not from water. It felt polished. There were no tool marks. No pickaxes had cut this. It looked like the stone had been melted and pressed into shape. "Sarge," Kowalski whispered from the front. "Look at this." We bunched up behind him. Kowalski was shining his light on a section of the floor. In the center of the tunnel, the dust had been disturbed. There was a track running down the middle of the path. It wasn't a footpath. It was a wide, shallow groove, about 2 feet across, as if a heavy log had been dragged down the slope. But the edges of the groove were too clean. Miller knelt and touched the dust. He rubbed it between his fingers and smelled it. "Oil?" I asked. "No," Miller said, "not oil. Wax or slime." He wiped his hand on his trousers. "Keep moving." We went deeper. The tunnel began to curve to the right. The air grew warmer, which was the opposite of what caves usually did. My skin felt tight. The silence was absolute. No dripping water, no wind. Just the sound of our breathing and the soft thud of our jungle boots on the packed floor. At the 100-yard mark, the tunnel opened up. We stepped into a chamber that our lights couldn't fully illuminate. The ceiling vanished into darkness above us. To our left and right, the walls curved away. "Spread out," Miller ordered. "Check the perimeter." I moved to the right wall, keeping my rifle tucked into my shoulder. The beam of my light played over the stone. Then it caught something. I stopped carved into the wall about eye level were a series of vertical lines. They weren't random cracks. They were deep, precise gouges, spaced exactly an inch apart. There were hundreds of them, running for 20 feet along the wall. I stepped closer. At the base of the wall below the carvings was a small pile of white fragments. I crouched down and picked one up. It was light and brittle. I shone the light on it. It was a piece of bone. A rib, maybe. But it was small. Too small for a man. Maybe a monkey or a dog. I looked at the pile again. There were skulls in there, small rodent-like skulls, but also larger ones. I saw a jawbone with teeth that looked human. "Miller," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the dead air. Miller came over. He looked at the scratches on the wall, then at the bones. He didn't say anything, he just looked. Then he turned his light toward the center of the room. "Group up," he said. We gathered in the center of the chamber. There was a stone structure there. It wasn't a table, and it wasn't a natural formation. It was a pillar of pale, translucent rock rising about 4 feet from the floor. The top of it was flat and dished, like a shallow bowl. Inside the bowl was a dark, crusty residue. "Is that blood?" Baker asked. His voice cracked. Doc Evans leaned in. He touched the residue with the tip of his knife. It flaked off. "Old," Doc said. "Very old. But yeah, that is organic." Kowalski was sweeping his light around the far side of the chamber. "Hey," he said. "I got another tunnel here, heading down." We looked where he was pointing. A dark archway led deeper into the hill. The drag mark we had seen earlier led straight to it and disappeared inside. "Sarge," Baker said. "Radio is dead. Totally dead. We should mark this and head back. Get a bird to blow this place." Miller looked at the tunnel, then at the pillar. He was weighing the mission against the feeling in his gut. I saw him touch the safety on his rifle, clicking it off and on again. "We go another 200 yards, Miller said. "We verify if this is a storage complex. If we don't find munitions, we turn back." "This ain't a storage complex, Sarge," I said. I didn't mean to speak, but the words came out. "Vasey don't build like this. Nobody builds like this." Miller looked at me. His eyes were hard, but I saw the doubt behind them. 200 yards, Corporal." "That is the order." We formed up again. Kowalski took point. We moved into the second tunnel. The slope became steeper. The air got thicker, heavier with that musk scent. It smelled like a reptile house at a zoo, but concentrated, fermented. My uniform was sticking to my back, but not from the heat. I was cold sweating. We had gone maybe 50 yards when we heard the sound for the first time. It stopped us all in our tracks. It came from deep below us, echoing up through the smooth throat of the tunnel. Click, click, pause, click, click. It was rhythmic, precise. It sounded like two heavy stones being tapped together, or the snapping of a giant joint. "Is that a signal?" Baker whispered. "Shh," Miller hissed. We stood there in the dark, straining to hear. The sound came again, click, click, louder this time, and then a different sound. A dry, rasping noise, like sandpaper on concrete. It lasted for 3 seconds, then stopped. "Movement," Kowalski said. "I got movement, 12 o'clock, way down." We all trained our lights down the tunnel. The beams cut through the dusty air, fading into the blackness. At the very edge of the light, maybe 80 yards away, I saw a shape. It wasn't a man. It was low to the ground. It was pale, almost white against the dark floor. It moved from the left side of the tunnel to the right, crossing the open space in a jerky fluid motion. It looked like a large lizard, maybe a monitor, but the way it moved was wrong. It didn't scuttle, it flowed. "Did you see that?" Doc asked. "I saw it," Miller said. He raised his rifle. "Contact front." The shape stopped. It was just a blur at the limit of our vision. Then 2 small points of light reflected back at us. Eyes, they were set wide apart. They didn't blink. They reflected the flashlight beams with a dull, reddish, green heavy glow. "Vasey," Baker asked, hope in his voice. "Is it a dog?" "That ain't no dog," Kowalski said. He racked the charging handle on the M60. The metal clack echoed loudly in the space. The eyes vanished. The shape dropped flat and seemed to dissolve into the floor. "It is gone," I said. "No," Miller said. "It is not gone. It is waiting." He moved us forward, slower this time. Every step felt like a trespass. The drag mark on the floor was deeper here. The dust on either side of it was disturbed, showing strange, 3-toed depressions that were too long to be human hands and too articulate to be animal paws. We reached the spot where we had seen the shape. There was nothing there. But on the wall, about 3 feet off the ground, was a fresh scratch. It cut deep into the polished stone, exposing lighter rock underneath. It was a single, clean slash parallel to the floor. "Look at the height," I said to Miller. Whatever made this was crouching. Miller didn't answer. He was looking at the ceiling. I looked up. The ceiling here was 20 feet high. Hanging from the stone directly above our heads was a substance that looked like dried foam. It was gray and porous, and embedded in it were things. I shined my light straight up. The foam held objects: a rusted French helmet from the 50s, a rotten canvas boot, a distinct curved magazine from an AK -47. They were stuck there, glued to the roof like trophies. "Christ," Doc whispered. "What is this?" Kowalski said. He was turning in a slow circle, the barrel of the M60 sweeping the walls. "It's a nest." The clicking sound started again. But it didn't come from below us this time. It came from behind us, from the chamber we had just left. Click, then an answer from the tunnel ahead. Click, click, then a third sound from somewhere inside the walls themselves. A low, vibrating thrum that I felt in the soles of my boots. Miller spun around. "They're flanking. Back to the chamber now." We turned to retreat, moving fast. I was in the lead now, with Miller and Kowalski covering the rear. We hurried up the slope, our breathing loud and ragged. The air seemed to be getting thinner, harder to pull into our lungs. We reached the entrance to the main chamber. I stepped through the archway and swung my light across the room. The pillar was gone. I stopped so fast that Doc bumped into me. "Clear the way," he shouted. "It is gone," I said. "The stone pillar, it moved." I swept the light to where the pillar had been. It wasn't there. But the floor where it had stood was actually a circular plate, a capstone. It had been slid aside, revealing a black vertical shaft going straight down. Standing on the edge of that shaft was Dow. He was facing away from us, looking down into the hole. His arms were hanging limp at his sides. He wasn't holding his rifle. "Dow," Miller barked. "Get away from there." Dow didn't turn, he didn't move. He just stood on the lip of the abyss, swaying slightly. "Dow, move," Miller yelled again. The clicking sound erupted from the shaft. It was a chorus now, dozens of sources overlapping. It sounded like dry rain. Dao spoke then. He didn't turn around. He spoke to the dark hole in Vietnamese. His voice was calm, conversational. He said 2 words. I didn't speak the language well, but I knew what they meant. Old masters. Then he stepped forward. He didn't jump. He just walked into the empty space. He dropped silently into the dark. There was no scream, just the sound of his body hitting the sides of the shaft as he tumbled down, and then a wet thud far, far below. We stood frozen. The shock held us for a second that felt like an hour. Then the radio on Baker's back cracked to life. It wasn't static, it wasn't bass. It was a voice. A deep, guttural mimicry of human speech that sounded like stones grinding together. It spoke English, but the intonation was wrong, broken, and pieced together from heard fragments. Go. Back. No. Kowalski screamed and opened fire on the shaft. The roar of the M60 was deafening in the confined space. Tracers poured into the hole, lighting up the walls of the pit in flashing red strobes. Cease fire, Miller yelled, grabbing Kowalski's harness. Save the ammo. Kowalski stopped. The gun smoked, the barrel glowing hot. The echoes of the shots died away. In the silence that followed, we heard the sound of sliding rock. We looked at the tunnel entrances, the one we had come from and the one leading deeper. From the shadows of both, shapes were emerging. They unfolded from the darkness, separating themselves from the walls. They were tall. They stood on 2 legs, but their posture was hunched, their spines curved forward. Their skin was a dull, mottled green, covered in dry scales that didn't reflect the light. Their heads were narrow, elongated, with no visible ears and flat, slit noses. But it was the eyes that froze my blood. They were the same eyes we had seen below, flat, dark, devoid of panic or anger. They looked at us with a biological curiosity. There were 3 of them blocking the exit to the surface. 3 more stood at the entrance to the lower tunnel. Circle, Miller shouted. Defensive circle. We backed toward the center of the room, away from the open shaft. We formed a tight ring, weapons pointing out. The creatures didn't rush. They didn't roar. They just stepped into the light, their movements synchronized. They held nothing in their hands, but their fingers were long, ending in curved black claws that looked like obsidian. The one closest to the exit tilted its head. It opened its mouth. Rows of small, translucent teeth caught the light. It let out a hiss, a sound like high-pressure steam venting. Steady, Miller said. His voice was the only thing holding us together. Pick your targets, short bursts. The creature took a step forward. It moved faster than anything that size should move. One moment it was still, the next it had closed 5 feet of distance. Fire, Miller ordered. We opened up. 5 M16s and the M60 erupted at once. The chamber turned into a strobe-lit nightmare of noise and smoke. I saw my rounds hit the lead creature. The bullets impacted the scales on its chest. Green fluid sprayed, thick and dark. The creature jerked back from the impact, but it didn't fall. It didn't even cry out. It absorbed the kinetic energy, rebalanced, and hissed again. They're not stopping, Baker yelled. Aim for the heads, Miller shouted. I shifted my aim. The creature lunged. It didn't run. It launched itself, clearing 10 feet in a single bound. It landed on the wall to my left, clinging to the smooth stone like a gecko, and then pushed off, twisting in the air toward us. That was when the lights went out. Not our flashlights, they were still on. But the darkness seemed to surge forward, swallowing the beams. The air pressure in the room dropped instantly, popping my ears. And then the screaming started. Not from the creatures, from us. The screaming didn't last long. It was cut short, not by a gunshot, but by a wet, heavy crunch that echoed off the smooth walls like a hammer hitting a melon. We didn't wait to see which one of us had been taken. Panic is a contagion, but training is the antibody, and Miller's voice cut through the chaos. He ordered us down the lower tunnel, the only path that wasn't blocked by the shapes. We moved. We didn't run, because running in the dark on slick stone is a good way to break a leg and get left behind. but we moved with a desperate, rigid urgency. We descended for 10 minutes without stopping. The gradient was steep, maybe 20 degrees, dragging us deeper into the guts of the ridge. The air grew colder with every 100 yards, losing that humid friction of the surface, and replaced by a sterile, refrigerated stillness. The noise of the ambush faded behind us, swallowed by the curve of the rock, until the only sound was the scuff of our jungle boots and the heavy, ragged breathing of 5 men trying to keep their terror locked down. Miller signaled a halt at a widening in the passage. We dropped to one knee, forming a defensive perimeter. Flashlights swept the darkness, cutting thin yellow cones through the gloom. The beams shook. It's hard to keep a steady hand when your heart is hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. "Sound off," Miller whispered. His voice was tight, but level. Kowalski. Green. Evans green. Baker. Green. Narrator. Green. We were all there, but the squad felt lighter. The absence of Dow and the way he had gone into that pit sat on us like a physical weight. We were 5 Americans in a hole in the earth, blind and deaf to the world above. "Check ammo," Miller ordered, "and check your lights. We conserve batteries from here on, 1 light on at a time. Rotate point." I checked my magazine. I had 20 rounds left in the mag and 4 more magazines in my webbing. Not enough for a war, just enough for a skirmish. We sat there for 5 minutes, listening. The tunnel was dead silent. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. I looked at the walls. Up here, the stone had changed. It wasn't the gray limestone of the upper caves anymore. It was darker, almost black, with veins of a quartz, like mineral running through it in jagged patterns. It didn't reflect our light, it absorbed it. "Sarge," Baker whispered. He was fiddling with the handset of the PRC -25. "I am getting something." Miller moved to him. "Voice?" "No," Baker said. He looked pale, his face shining with cold sweat. "Not voice. Listen." He held the handset out. We leaned in. Through the static, faint but rhythmic, came a sound. It was a low, mechanical thrumming. Thump, thump, pause. Thump, thump. It sounded like a heavy heart beating slow or a large machine idling deep underground. "Is that a generator?" Kowalski asked. "Maybe the NVA have power down here." Miller shook his head. "Generators vibrate. They hum. This is percussion. It is distant." He stood up. "We keep moving. We find a secondary exit. These systems usually have vents or drainage channels. We find one. We blow it. We climb out." He was lying. We all knew he was lying. You don't climb out of a complex like this, but we needed a direction, so we followed him. We pushed deeper. The tunnel leveled out after another quarter-mile. The architecture changed again. The smooth, fused walls gave way to something that looked more worked. The floor became perfectly flat. The ceiling rose to a uniform height of 12 feet. We were walking through a corridor that had been engineered. The air quality shifted. The sour musk smell returned, but now it was mixed with something else. Ammonia, sharp and stinging. It burned the inside of my nose. "Masks," Miller said. "If you got 'em, rag up." We tied towels and sweat rags around our faces. It didn't help much. The smell was heavy, sinking into the fabric of our fatigues. And the tapping started again. It wasn't like the clicking in the upper chamber. This was different. It came from the walls on either side of us. A dull, hollow tapping, tap, tap, tap. Then silence, then from the other side, tap, tap. It tracked us. When we walked, the tapping moved with us, staying parallel to our position. When we stopped, the tapping stopped. "There in the walls," I said. "There are passages behind the stone." Kowalski swung the M60 toward the left wall. "I can punch through, I can light 'em up." "No," Miller said. "You shoot that wall. You might bring the roof down. We hold fire until we see a target." The psychological toll was getting to us. I could feel it in the way the men moved. Baker was flinching at every shadow. Doc Evans kept checking his rear, turning in circles. The discipline was fraying. We were trained to fight men. Men scream when you shoot them. Men bleed. Men have fear. The things in the dark had none of that. They were operating on a set of rules we didn't have the manual for. We walked for an hour. The tapping continued, a constant escort in the dark. It felt like we were being herded, guided toward a destination we hadn't chosen. The corridor ended in a massive open space. Miller called for all lights. We switched them on and swept the beams. The light didn't reach the far wall. We were standing on the edge of a cavern that dwarfed the upper chamber. The floor here was covered in a layer of fine, gray dust, inches deep. It muffled our footsteps completely. But it wasn't just dust. As we moved into the room, kicking up small clouds that hung in the stagnant air, we saw what the floor was made of. "Hold up," Doc said. He knelt down. He reached into the dust and pulled something out. It was a sheet of pale, translucent material about the size of a man's torso. It crinkled like dry parchment in his hand. "Paper?" Kowalski asked. Doc shook his head. He shone his light through the material. It had a pattern. Tiny, interlocking hexagonal scales. "Skin," Doc said. His voice was flat, clinical. "It is molted skin, all of this. The dust, it is all dead skin." I looked around the cavern. The piles of gray dust stretched into the darkness. There were mounds of it against the walls. Millions of layers of shed epidermis accumulated over centuries. We were standing in a graveyard of discarded cells. "Look at the size of this piece," Doc said, holding it up. "Whatever shed this, the chest cavity alone is 4 feet wide." Miller kicked a pile of the dust. Underneath, the floor was marked. "Bring the light here," Miller said. I moved my light to where he pointed. Imprinted in the dust, preserved perfectly in the stillness of the cave, was a track. It was fresh. The edges were sharp. It was a 3-toed print, splayed wide to distribute weight. But it wasn't like a bird's foot. The toes were thick, fleshy pads ending in deep gouges where the claws had dug in. The print was 2 feet long. Miller placed his own boot next to it. The print dwarfed his size 12 jungle boot. "The stride," Miller noted, shining the light forward to the next print. "Look at the gap. The distance between the prints was nearly 8 feet. "It was running," I said. "No," Miller said quietly. "Walking. If it was running, the toes would be dug in deeper at the front. This thing was walking." A heavy, metallic clang echoed through the cavern. We all spun around. The sound had come from the darkness ahead of us. It sounded like a steel door being slammed shut. "Front," Kowalski yelled. We formed a line, weapons raised. The echo of the slam died away, leaving only the sound of our own heavy breathing. "Baker," Miller said, not taking his eyes off the dark. "Get the radio up now. High frequency. Any channel. I don't care if you call Hanoi. Just get someone." Baker scrambled with the set. "Sarge," the interference. "It is worse here." "Do it," Miller snapped. While Baker worked the dials, I watched the edge of the light. The dust in the air was moving, not from a draft, but from displacement. Something large was moving just beyond the reach of our beams, stirring the air currents. "I got something," Baker said. "It is a signal, strong signal." "Put it on speaker," Miller said. Baker twisted a knob. The hiss of static filled the silence. Then a voice cut through. It was clear. American, a standard radio operator's cadence. "Echo 3, this is Red Crown. We read you 5 by 5. Over." We all looked at each other. Relief, sharp and painful, hit me in the chest. "Red Crown, this is Echo 3 actual," Miller said into the handset. "We are in deep, heavy contact, casualties. We are inside the ridge structure. Request immediate extraction, over." There was a pause. The static hissed. "Copy Echo 3, the voice said. "What is your position, over?" "Unknown," Miller said. "We are subterranean, approximately 1 click east of insertion. We need a dust-off." "We are combat ineffective." Another pause. Copy that, Echo 3. Hold position, relief is inbound. Can you mark target with strobe? Over. Negative on strobe, Miller said. We are underground. You can't see us. We can see you, Echo 3, the voice said. The tone changed. It wasn't the flat, bored voice of a radio operator anymore. It shifted. The pitch dropped. The cadence became mechanical, broken. We see. You, Miller. Miller froze. He stared at the handset. Who is this? The radio static cleared. The voice that came back was not electronic. It was the same grinding, stone, on stone mimicry we had heard in the upper chamber. Meet waits. Then the radio emitted a high-pitched shriek, a feedback loop so loud it forced us to cover our ears. Baker ripped the batteries out of the set. The silence rushed back in. Miller stood up slowly. His face was gray. He looked at the vast, dust-covered room, then at the darkness ahead. They aren't calling for help, Miller said. They're toying with us. Sarge, Kowalski whispered. The dust. I looked down. The floor around us was vibrating. The granules of gray skin were dancing, bouncing slightly in a rhythmic pattern. The vibration grew stronger. It wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from the floor, from beneath the layers of shed skin. Move, Miller said. Move now to the wall. We broke for the side of the cavern. We were halfway there when the floor in the center of the room exploded. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was an eruption of motion. The deep drifts of dust blasted upward as something massive breached the surface like a whale breaching water. I turned my head as I ran. Through the cloud of gray powder, I saw a shape rising. It was huge, larger than the ones in the tunnel. Its scales were dark, almost black and ridged like armor plating. It didn't have the sleek build of the hunters. This was a tank, a siege engine of muscle and bone. It let out a roar that wasn't a sound, but a shockwave. It hit me in the back, knocking the wind out of my lungs. I stumbled, fell into the dust, and rolled. Get up. Doc Evans screamed, grabbing my webbing. Get up. I scrambled to my feet. The creature was fully out of the dust now. It stood 15 feet tall. Its head was a nightmare of bone crests and scars. It swept a long, heavy tail through the air, smashing into a stone formation and shattering it to dust. Kowalski turned. He didn't wait for orders. He leveled the M60 and held the trigger down. The tracers drew a line of fire straight into the creature's chest. The bullets sparked off the black scales. It was like shooting an armored personnel carrier. The creature didn't even flinch. It turned its head slowly, focusing those dead, flat eyes on Kowalski. Run, Miller roared. We sprinted for a narrow fissure in the far wall. It was a crack in the rock barely wide enough for a man. I dove into the fissure first, scraping my shoulders on the sharp stone. Doc followed. Then Miller grabbed Kowalski, who was still firing, and dragged him backward toward the gap. The creature took one step. The ground shook so hard I nearly lost my footing. It raised a clawed hand, the size of a shovel, and swiped at the space where Kowalski had been standing a second before. The claws cut through the air with a sound like tearing canvas. Miller shoved Kowalski into the crack and squeezed in after him. Go, Miller yelled. Don't stop. We squeezed through the tight rock, the rough edges tearing at our uniforms. Behind us, the creature roared again, and then came the sound of stone shattering as it began to hammer against the wall, trying to widen the crack to get to us. We were in a narrow chimney now, heading up. We climbed. We clawed at the rock. My fingernails broke. My knees bled. We didn't look back. We just climbed, driven by the primal knowledge that the thing behind us was too big to follow, but it had friends that weren't, and from the darkness above us the clicking started again. Waiting. The chimney narrowed as we climbed. The rock was sharp against our knees and elbows, tearing through fatigues and skin alike. We moved in a vertical file, boots scraping for purchase on the uneven stone. I was second, right behind Miller. Below me was Doc Evans, and below him was Baker. Kowalski brought up the rear, heaving the bulk of the M60 up the shaft with a strength that was born entirely of adrenaline. The air in the shaft was stagnant. The dust from the cavern below had followed us up, coating our throats with that dry, dead taste of shed skin. But as we climbed higher, a new smell drifted down to meet us. It wasn't the sour, musk scent of the reptiles. It was the copper, heavy, sweet smell of fresh blood. We pulled ourselves onto a ledge about 60 feet up. It opened into a network of smaller tunnels, distinct from the grand, engineered corridors below. These were rough-hewn, jagged cuts in the rock that looked like natural fault lines. We collapsed on the stone floor, chests heaving, lungs burning for oxygen that wasn't there. "Sound off," Miller wheezed. Narrator, "Good." Doc, "Good." Kowalski, "Good." There was a pause, a silence that stretched 2 seconds too long. "Baker," Miller said. "I am here." Baker's voice came from the edge of the shaft. I am good," radio's heavy Sarge. "Drink water," Miller ordered. 2 sips. "Then we move." We fumbled for our canteens. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely unscrew the cap. The water was warm and tasted of plastic, but it washed the dust out of my mouth. I sat with my back against the cold wall listening. The roaring of the massive creature below had stopped. The tapping had stopped. The silence was back, heavy and suffocating. "Where are we?" Doc whispered. He was cleaning his glasses with a trembling hand. "Upper systems," Miller said. He was checking his compass, but he tapped the glass face like he didn't trust the reading. "Needle is spinning. Magnetic interference. We head up. Heat rises, air flows up. We follow the draft." We stood up. Legs cramped. Muscles protested. Miller took point. "Baker, you take the middle," Miller said. "Keep that radio protected. Kowalski, rear guard. Keep that 60 ready." We moved into the rough tunnel. The ceiling was low, forcing us to hunch over. The jagged walls snagged our rucksacks. It felt like walking down the throat of an animal that had swallowed us whole. We had gone 50 yards when the smell of blood got stronger. It was overpowering now. We turned a corner and stopped. Lying in the center of the tunnel was a pile of fatigued shirts, boots, and webbing. It wasn't scattered, it was folded, almost neatly. Miller stepped forward and shone his light on the gear. It was NVA equipment, canvas chest rigs, pith helmets, rubber sandals. But there were no bodies, just the clothes. "Where are the men?" Doc asked. Miller kicked a bundle of clothes. "No blood on the gear," he said. "Whatever took them, undressed them first." "Or they took them out of the clothes," Kowalski said from the back. "Like shucking an oyster." That image hit me hard. I looked at the dark tunnel ahead. The clicking sound started again. It came from the ceiling this time. Click, click, it was right above us. Miller swung his light up. The beam hit the rough stone roof. There was nothing there, just cracks and shadows. "Move," Miller said. Double time. We sped up, moving as fast as we could in the crouch. The clicking followed. It wasn't one source anymore. It was a ripple of sound moving along the ceiling, matching our pace. It sounded like hundreds of hard nails tapping on stone. We reached a junction, left or right. Miller paused for a fraction of a second, feeling for air. "Right," he said. We turned right. Baker stumbled. His foot caught on a ridge of stone and he went down on one knee. The heavy radio shifted on his back, pinning him for a second. "Help him," Miller barked. I turned back to grab Baker's harness. Doc was already reaching for him. I got it," Baker said, scrambling to get his feet under him. As he stood up, the wall beside him exploded outward. It wasn't an explosion of fire. A section of the rock wall, which had looked solid a second ago, simply crumbled away. A dark, blurred shape shot out of the hole. It was fast, too fast to track. It didn't strike Baker. It didn't bite him, too long, pale arms wrapped around his waist and chest. Baker didn't even have time to scream. The force of the impact lifted him off his feet. He was yanked sideways, pulled into the hole in the wall with the violence of a car crash. The radio antenna whipped against the stone. Then he was gone. "Baker!" I shouted. I lunged for the hole. Doc grabbed my belt and pulled me back. "Don't." I shone my light into the breach. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a vertical chute, slick and steep, going down into the dark. I saw the soles of Baker's boots sliding away. I saw the green light of the radio handset swinging. Then I heard the sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a wet, heavy tear, like a wet towel being ripped in half. Then the crunch of bone. Then silence. "He is gone," Miller said. His voice was cold, devoid of shock. Back to the junction. We can't leave him," I yelled. I pointed my rifle into the hole. "He is dead, Corporal," Miller said. He grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. "Did you hear that sound? He is dead. We move now." We ran back to the junction. We didn't walk, we ran. The discipline was cracking, the terror was setting in. We took the left tunnel. It widened out, the ceiling rising enough for us to stand straight. We sprinted. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would burst. The clicking was all around us now. It was a frenzy of sound, click, click, click. They were communicating. They were celebrating. "They're hurting us," Kowalski yelled from the rear. "They're pushing us." "Keep moving," Miller shouted. We ran for another 5 minutes until our lungs burned. The tunnel opened into a large rectangular chamber. It looked like a gallery. The walls were smooth again, carved with those same vertical lines we had seen earlier. Miller stopped in the center of the room. "Halt, perimeter." We formed a triangle. Miller, me, Kowalski. Doc was in the middle, shaking, holding his medic bag like a shield. "Lights," Miller said. "All lights." We turned on every flashlight we had. The beams cut through the gloom. The room was filled with them. They were clinging to the walls. They were crouched on the floor. They were hanging from the ceiling. There must have been 20 of them. They were still, perfectly still. In the full light, we saw them clearly for the first time. They were humanoid, but wrong. Their legs were digitigrade, like a dog or a dinosaur, ending in 3-toed feet with thick black claws. Their torsos were long and thin, covered in pale green scales that looked dry and dusty. Their arms were too long, hanging down past their knees. But it was the faces. They had no lips. Just a hard, bony ridge that formed a mouth. Their noses were flat slits, and their eyes. Those flat black eyes were set wide on their skulls, giving them a field of view that covered almost everything. They didn't make a sound. They just watched us. The clicking had stopped. "Check fire," Miller whispered. "Nobody shoots unless they move." We stood there, 3 men with rifles against a nightmare. The creatures were motionless. They looked like statues carved from jade and bone. "Why aren't they attacking?" Doc whispered. "They're waiting," Miller said. "They're waiting for the order." One of the creatures on the floor, a large male with a ridge of spines running down his back, slowly stood up. He was tall, maybe 7 feet. He looked at Miller. He tilted his head. Then he opened his mouth and hissed. It wasn't an animal hiss. It sounded like a hydraulic press releasing air. "Back up," Miller said, slowly toward that passage. He nodded toward a narrow archway on the far side of the room. We took a step back. The creatures on the wall shifted. A ripple of movement went through them. We took another step. The large male took a step forward. He mirrored us. "They're cutting the angle," Kowalski said. "They're flanking. Run for the arch," Miller yelled. We broke formation and sprinted. The moment we moved, the room exploded into motion. The creatures didn't run like men. They moved in bursts of speed that the eye couldn't follow. 1 second they were on the wall. The next they were on the floor, cutting off our path. "Fire, fire," Miller screamed. We opened up. The sound of 3 M16s and the booming report of the M60 filled the chamber. It was deafening. I saw my bullets hit the nearest creature. The rounds impacted the chest and shoulder. Fluid sprayed. Dark, almost black blood. The creature flinched, knocked back by the force, but it didn't fall. It didn't scream. It just planted its feet, hissed, and lunged again. "They don't stop," I yelled. I hit him center mass. He didn't stop. "Keep shooting," Miller roared. We reached the archway. Kowalski turned and unleashed a long burst from the hip. The heavy 7.62 rounds tore into the group of creatures pursuing us. These rounds did damage. I saw limbs blown off. I saw scales shatter. One of the creatures went down, thrashing silently in the dust. "Go! Go!" Kowalski screamed over the roar of the gun. We dove through the archway. It led into a dead-end room. It was a small chamber, maybe 20 feet square. No exit, no other tunnels. Just the one door we had come through. "Trap," Miller said. He spun around. "It is a box." They herded us into a box. "Defensive positions," Miller ordered. "Kowalski, get the gun on the door. Doc, get behind us. Narrator, take the left." I got right. We slammed our bodies against the walls. Kowalski dropped the M60's bipod on a pile of rubble facing the door. He fed a fresh belt into the tray. "Here they come," Kowalski yelled. Shadows stretched across the floor of the archway. The creatures were gathering outside. They weren't rushing in. They knew we were trapped. The smell wafted in first, that intense, dry ammonia stench. It made my eyes water. Then, a hand reached around the frame of the door. A long, clawed hand. It gripped the stone, crumbling the edge. "Wait for a target," Miller said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain in it. Controlled bursts. Conserve ammo. A head popped around the corner. Low, fast. Kowalski fired a 3-round burst. The head disintegrated. The creature dropped. "One," Kowalski shouted. Then they came. They didn't come one by one. They flooded the doorway, 3, 4, 5 of them. They came high and low. Some ran on the floor. Others leaped for the ceiling, using their momentum to swing into the room. Contact. The room became a hell of noise and muzzle flash. The strobe effect of the gunfire made the movement of the creatures look jerky, like a reel of film missing frames. I fired at a shape leaping toward me. The bullets hit it in midair. It twisted, landed on its feet, and slashed at me. I threw myself backward. The claws missed my face by an inch, cutting the air with a swish. I fired again, point blank into its stomach. The creature stumbled back, leaking black fluid, but its eyes, those dead eyes, never changed expression. It raised its arm to strike again. Miller shot it from the side. A burst to the neck. It collapsed. "Or loading," I screamed, dropping the empty mag. "Keep them back," Miller shouted. Kowalski was the anchor. The M60 was chopping them down. The heavy rounds were punching through scales and bone. Bodies were piling up in the doorway, but they kept coming. They scrambled over their dead without hesitation. One of the creatures, smaller than the rest, managed to cling to the ceiling above the door. It dropped down behind Kowalski. "Behind you!" Doc screamed. Doc threw himself at the creature. He had no gun, just his K-bar knife. He tackled the thing, driving the knife into its side. The creature didn't even acknowledge the wound. It backhanded Doc with a casual, brutal force. Doc flew across the room and hit the wall with a sickening crack. He slid down and didn't move. Kowalski spun around, swinging the barrel of the machine gun. The creature slashed. The claws raked across Kowalski's chest, shredding his flak vest and the flesh beneath. Kowalski roared, not in pain, but in rage. He jammed the muzzle of the M60 into the creature's chest and pulled the trigger. The blast blew the creature apart. Kowalski fell to one knee. Blood was pouring from his chest. "Ski," I yelled. "I am good." Kowalski gargled, spitting blood. He forced himself back up, turning the gun back to the door. "Feed me. Someone feed me." I scrambled over to him, grabbing the belt of ammo. I fed the gun. Miller stood on the other side, firing his M16 on semi-automatic now, picking his shots. The pile of dead creatures in the doorway was waist-high. The attack stopped. Sudden silence. The room was filled with smoke and the smell of cordite and copper. My ears were ringing so hard I couldn't hear my own breathing. "Doc," Miller said. I looked at the wall. Doc Evans was slumped there. His neck was at a wrong angle. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. "He is gone," I said. My voice sounded distant. Kowalski was leaning against the rock, pressing a hand to his chest. Dark blood oozed between his fingers. He looked pale. "How many rounds?" Miller asked. He was staring at the doorway, rifle raised. "Belts low," I said. "Maybe 50 rounds for the pig. I got 1 mag left." "I am out," Miller said. He pulled his Colt .45 pistol from his holster. "I got 7 shots." We listened. The clicking had stopped. Then, from the darkness of the corridor outside, came a new sound. It wasn't a hiss, it wasn't a click, it was a voice. It was Baker's voice, but it wasn't coming from a throat. It sounded like it was being played back on a slow tape, deep and distorted. "Help me, Sarge." Miller flinched. His hand shook. Legs broken, dark, help. "It is a trick," Kowalski wheezed. "Don't listen. Please, cold, so cold." The voice changed pitch. It shifted from Baker's terrified plea to that grinding mechanical tone we had heard on the radio. "Come out, meet, spoil." Miller stepped forward. His face was a mask of cold fury. He raised the pistol. "We aren't dying in here," Miller said. "And we aren't listening to that." He looked at me, then at Kowalski. "We rush them," Miller said. "We use the last of the belt. We punch a hole through the line. We run for the upper vents." "I can't run, Sarge," Kowalski said softly. He looked at his legs. A pool of blood was forming around his boots. Miller looked at him. For the first time, the sergeant's mask slipped. I saw the grief there. "You can make it," Miller said. "No," Kowalski said. He smiled, and his teeth were red. "I can't, but I can hold the door." He dragged the M60 up onto the pile of rubble. He settled the stock against his shoulder. "Leave me the grenades," Kowalski said. Miller stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. He unclipped his grenades and set them next to Kowalski. I did the same. "Go," Kowalski said. "Before I bleed out." Miller grabbed my arm. "Move." We moved to the edge of the doorway. "Ready." Kowalski whispered. He pulled the charging handle back. "Give him hell, Ski," I said. "Get gone," he said. Kowalski opened fire. The roar of the gun filled the world. He didn't fire in bursts. He held the trigger down. A continuous stream of lead poured into the corridor. Miller and I broke cover. We sprinted past Kowalski, jumping over the pile of lizard bodies. We ran into the corridor. The creatures were there, massed in the shadows, but the hail of bullets forced them back. They scattered, climbing the walls to avoid the fire. We ran, we didn't look back. Behind us, the M60 hammered on. It was the sound of defiance. Then the firing stopped. There was a pause. A silence that lasted 1 heartbeat. Then came the sound of the grenades. 1, 2, 3 explosions in rapid succession. The shockwave rolled down the corridor, blowing dust and debris past us. Then silence. Miller didn't stop. He didn't look back. He just kept running up the incline toward the faint draft of fresh air that promised a way out of hell. But I knew, as I ran beside him, that a part of us was staying in that room forever. We moved up the throat of the mountain. The air grew thinner, losing the dead, recycled quality of the deep chambers and carrying the faint electric taste of ozone. Rain. It was raining outside. That smell which had once meant misery and rot in the bush now smelled like salvation. Miller was slowing down. I could hear it in his breathing. A wet, rattling intake of air that didn't sound right. He stumbled on a loose scree of rocks going down to one knee. I grabbed his webbing and hauled him up. His skin was gray, drained of blood, and slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the heat of exertion. "Keep moving, Sarge," I rasped. My own throat felt like it was filled with ground glass. "I am moving," Miller grunted. He pushed himself off the wall, but his legs were heavy, uncoordinated. We were in a natural fault line now, a vertical fissure that zigzagged toward the surface. The walls were tight, pressing in on our shoulders. Behind us, deep in the dark, the sound of pursuit had changed. The clicking was gone. The heavy thrumming was gone. Now, it was just the sound of friction. Soft, continuous, like dry snakeskin sliding over stone. They weren't hunting anymore. They were closing the distance. We reached a ledge where the fissure narrowed into a chimney climb. I shone my light up. I could see roots, thick, white roots of jungle trees, dangling through the cracks in the rock 20 feet above, and past them, a faint, gray light. "Daylight," I said. "We're there." I turned to Miller. He was leaning against the rock face, his head bowed. His hands were resting on his knees, and for the first time, I saw the dark stains spreading across the side of his fatigues. Just above the hip, he had been hit. Maybe back in the chamber, maybe by a ricochet, maybe by a claw. He hadn't said a word. "You are hit," I said. Miller looked up. His eyes were glassy, losing focus. He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace of bared teeth. "Just a scratch, Corporal. Don't put me in for a Purple Heart yet." He tried to take a step toward the climb, and his leg buckled. He slid down the wall, hitting the stone floor with a heavy thud. I dropped beside him, reaching for my field dressing. Miller slapped my hand away. His grip was weak, but his intent was iron. "Stop," he wheezed. "Stop it. Look at the wound." I looked. The fabric of his uniform was torn. Beneath it, the flesh wasn't just cut. It was gray, necrotic. The veins radiating from the wound were black, tracing a web of poison across his torso. It wasn't bleeding anymore. It was festering, the infection moving with impossible speed. "They have venom," Miller whispered, "or bacteria, doesn't matter." I can't feel my legs. The sliding sound below us grew louder. A pebble clattered down the shaft, then another. "They're here," Miller said. "I can carry you," I said. It was a lie. We both knew it. I could barely lift my rifle. Miller reached into his webbing and pulled out his last grenade. He looked at it, then at the narrow choke point of the fissure below us. "You go," Miller said. He didn't say it like an order. He said it like a statement of fact. "You climb, you get to the radio, you call the rain." "I am not leaving you, Miller." "You are," Miller said. He looked me in the eye. The soldier was gone. The NCO was gone. It was just a man looking at the end. Someone has to tell them what is down here. If we both die, this place stays a secret. They win. You understand, they win. He shoved the grenade into his hand and curled his fingers around the spoon. He pulled the pin with his teeth and spat it onto the floor. "I am holding the spoon," Miller said. "As long as I am awake, I hold it. When they get here, or when I fade out, I let go. That collapses the tunnel." I stared at him. The sliding noise was close now. I could smell the ammonia stench of them drifting up the shaft. "Go," Miller roared. It was the last burst of command left in him. I stood up. I didn't salute. There are no salutes in a hole in the ground. I turned and grabbed the roots hanging from the ceiling. I pulled myself up, my boots scraping against the stone. I climbed 10 feet. I looked down. Miller was sitting with his back to the wall, facing the dark curve of the tunnel below. He had his Colt .45 in his right hand and the grenade in his left. He wasn't looking at me. He was watching the dark. "Come on," I heard him whisper. "Come and get it." I scrambled up the last 10 feet, tearing my hands on the sharp rock. I squeezed through a gap in the stone, fighting against the roots that tried to hold me back. I broke through the surface. The sensory shock hit me like a physical blow. Heat, wet, suffocating heat. The roar of the monsoon rain on the canopy, the screaming of monkeys, the smell of green life and wet mud. I rolled onto my back in the slush, gasping for air. The sky above was a flat, angry gray, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I lay there for a second, waiting. Thump. The ground shook beneath me, a muffled, dull concussion from deep underground. It wasn't a sharp crack. It was the sound of the earth swallowing something. Miller let go. I forced myself up. I was covered in gray dust that was turning to paste in the rain. I was bleeding from a dozen cuts. My rifle was gone, left in the shaft. I looked at the hole I had just crawled out of. It was a small fissure under the roots of a massive banyan tree. It looked like nothing, just a shadow in the jungle. I backed away. I expected them to burst out. I expected the green shapes to pour from the earth, hungry for the light, but they didn't. Movement caught my eye, just inside the fissure where the rain didn't reach. A shape stood there. It was one of them, the tall one, the hunter. It stood just behind the curtain of roots, its body merging with the shadows. The daylight stopped at the cave mouth, and so did the creature. It didn't step into the rain. It didn't hiss. It just watched. Its flat, black eyes locked onto mine. There was no anger in them, no frustration. It looked at me with a terrifying, ancient patience. It knew where I belonged, and it knew where it belonged. It had pushed me out of its world, and that was enough. The creature raised one hand slowly. It placed its clawed palm against the rock wall. It held it there for a second, a gesture that looked almost like a farewell or a warning. Stay out. Then it stepped back into the dark and vanished. I turned and ran. I ran through the jungle, crashing through vines, sliding down mud banks, falling and getting up and running again. I didn't check my compass. I didn't check for booby traps. I just ran away from the hill. I broke into a clearing a mile later. I fumbled for my emergency strobe, popped the cover, and threw it into the tall grass. The pulsing white light flashed against the gray rain. I waited. I huddled in the mud, shivering violently despite the heat. Every time a branch snapped, I flinched. Every time the wind moved the bamboo, I saw a green scale. 10 minutes later, the rhythmic thumping returned, but this time it was coming from the sky. A one Huey drive opped over the tree line. Its nose dipped low, the rotor wash flattening the grass. The side gunner was leaning out, scanning the ground. They touched down. I scrambled toward the bird, the mud sucking at my boots. The gunner grabbed my vest and hauled me inside. Go, go, go. The gunner yelled into his headset. The pilot pulled pitch, and the chopper surged upward. The stomach-dropping sensation of lift was the greatest relief of my life. The gunner looked at me. He looked at the empty seats. He looked at the gray dust caked on my skin. "Where are they?" he shouted over the engine noise. "Where is the rest of the squad?" I looked out the open door. We were banking hard, turning back toward base. Below us, Hill 802 rose out of the mist. It looked like any other ridge in the highlands, green, silent, majestic. It didn't look like a tomb. It didn't look like a nest. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. I just shook my head. The gunner stared at me for a long moment, then looked away. He understood enough. He went back to scanning the tree line, his hand tight on the spade grips of his M60. I leaned my head against the vibrating metal of the fuselage and closed my eyes. But I couldn't sleep. Even over the roar of the rotor blades, I could still hear it. Click, click, we landed at Camp Evans an hour later. I didn't go to the mess hall. I didn't go to the barracks. I was met on the tarmac by 2 MPs. They didn't ask if I was hurt. They escorted me directly to a corrugated metal hut on the edge of the perimeter wire. Inside, it was cool. An air conditioner hummed in the window. There was a desk, 2 chairs, and a man in a clean uniform with no rank insignia. He was smoking a cigarette. He had a file on the desk. He didn't offer me a seat. He didn't offer me water. "Corporal," he said. His voice was dry. "Sit down," I sat. The chair was metal and hard. "We have your report," the man said. He didn't look at the file, he looked at me. "Or rather, we have the lack of one. Your squad went dark for 6 hours. Then you popped smoke alone." "They're dead," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "All of them, Miller. Kowalski, Doc Baker, Dow." "Enemy contact?" the man asked. He picked up a pen. "No," I said. "Not enemy, something else in the caves," I told him. I told him everything. I told him about the smooth tunnels, the smell of ammonia, the piles of skin, the clicking, the things that moved faster than sight. I told him about Dow jumping. I told him about the nest on the ceiling. I told him about Miller holding the spoon. The man listened. He didn't write anything down. He smoked his cigarette, watching me through the haze of blue smoke. His face didn't change. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look skeptical. When I finished, silence filled the room. The air conditioner hummed. The man stubbed out his cigarette. He opened the file. It was empty. "Here's what happened, Corporal," he said. He spoke slowly, emphasizing every word. Echo 3 engaged a superior NVA force near Hill 802. You were ambushed. The enemy used RPGs and heavy mortars. The cave system collapsed during the firefight. Your squad was buried. You were the sole survivor. You suffered a concussion and dehydration." He looked at me. "That is the official record." "That is a lie," I said. "You can't leave them there. We need to go back. We need to bomb that hill. We need to burn it out." The man leaned forward. His eyes were cold, not the flat, dead cold of the lizards, but the sharp, calculated cold of a bureaucracy that had already done the math. "There is no hill to burn, Corporal. We aren't going back to 802. That sector is now a permanent, no fire zone. We are pulling all patrols back 5 clicks. He paused. "You think you are the first one to come out of a hole telling stories about monsters?" he asked softly. "You think Vietnam is the only place with hollow ground?" He closed the file. "You are being transferred, stateside, medical discharge, full benefits. You go home, you get a job. You raise a family and you never ever speak about this again, because if you do, nobody will believe you. They'll just say the war broke your head." He stood up. "Do we understand each other?" I looked at his hands. They were clean. No dirt, no blood, no gray dust. "Yes, I understand. I left Vietnam 3 days later. I spent a month in a hospital in San Diego. Then I went back to Ohio. I got a job at a Ford plant. I married a good woman. I had 2 sons. I lived the life they told me to live, but I never went into a basement. I never walked in the woods at night. And when the cicadas start their buzzing in the summer heat, when that rhythmic clicking fills the air, I have to go inside and lock the door. The man in the suit was wrong about one thing. He said we lost the squad to the NVA. We didn't lose them to the enemy. We fed them to the earth. I check the news sometimes. I look for reports of geological surveys, of new mining projects, of deep earth explorations. I see the excitement in the scientists' eyes when they talk about new frontiers beneath the crust. They talk about resources. They talk about history. They have no idea. We treat the ground like it's just dirt. We think we own the surface, so we own what is below it, but we don't. We are just tenants living on the roof of a house we have never seen the inside of. And sometimes when the house is quiet and the traffic outside dies down, I can hear them, not in my head, in the earth. I put my ear to the floorboards in the dead of winter, and I listen. Click. They are still down there. They are waiting, and they have all the time in the world.